2,500 years ago, a philosopher sat down and wrote about a civilization so powerful, so advanced, so magnificent, that when it finally fell, the ocean swallowed it whole. That philosopher was Plato, and the civilization he described was Atlantis. Since that moment, the story of Atlantis has never left us. It has inspired explorers, obsessed scientists, launched expeditions to the bottom of the sea, and fueled some of the most passionate debates in the history of archaeology. It has appeared in the works of Francis Bacon, who imagined a utopian island civilization in the Atlantic. It inspired Jules Verne, who sent Captain Nemo gliding over its sunken ruins. It has been the subject of more books, documentaries, and scientific papers than almost any other topic in the ancient world. But here is the question that matters. Was Atlantis real? Not the Hollywood version. Not the fantasy. The actual historical question. Did a powerful, sophisticated civilization exist thousands of years before recorded history? And did it collapse so completely that almost nothing survived? Because the answer to that question is far more interesting than most people realize. And the journey toward that answer takes us through Egyptian temples, volcanic islands, the depths of the ocean, and the very nature of how human memory works. My name is Brian, and this is Vanished Worlds. Tonight, we follow one of the oldest mysteries in human history, from the writings of an ancient philosopher, to the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, to the volcanic ruins of a Bronze Age island in the Mediterranean Sea. This is the story of Atlantis. Everything begins with two dialogues written by Plato around 360 BC, Timaeus and Critias. In these texts, Plato describes a conversation between several Athenian philosophers and a man named Critias, who claims to be passing down a story told to his ancestor Solon, one of Athens' greatest statesmen, by Egyptian priests in the city of Sais. The Egyptian priests, according to Critias, possessed records going back thousands of years. Records that Athens itself had lost in floods and catastrophes. And in those ancient records, they had preserved the story of Atlantis. According to this account, 9,000 years before Plato's time, there existed a great naval empire on a large island in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we today call the Strait of Gibraltar. This empire was called Atlantis. Plato describes it in extraordinary detail. The island was circular, roughly the size of Libya and Asia Minor combined. It was divided by concentric rings of water and land, alternating bands of sea and earth arranged like the rings of a target. Massive bridges connected each ring to the next. Canals allowed ships to pass from the ocean all the way to the center of the island. At its heart stood a magnificent palace and temple dedicated to the god Poseidon, clad in gold, silver, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, second in value only to gold itself. The temple's roof gleamed in the sunlight. Its walls were encrusted with precious stones. Around it, hot and cold springs flowed from the earth, feeding elaborate bathing complexes for citizens of every class. The Atlanteans were powerful. They had conquered much of Europe and Africa. Their military was enormous. 10,000 chariots, 1,200 ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Their wealth was unimaginable. 5 sets of twin kings ruled this empire, descended from the god Poseidon himself and a mortal woman named Cleito. For generations, they governed wisely, guided by divine law inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum at the heart of their great temple. But then something changed. The Atlanteans, Plato writes, became corrupted. Their divine nature faded as the human element in their blood grew stronger. Greed replaced wisdom. Ambition replaced virtue. They turned their armies toward Athens, but Athens alone repelled them. And then came the punishment. Zeus, seeing the corruption that had spread through Atlantis, gathered the gods to pass judgment. And in a single day and night of catastrophic violence, the gods sent earthquakes and floods. The island of Atlantis sank beneath the waves. Gone. Forever. Or was it? For most of history, educated people assumed Plato had simply invented Atlantis, a philosophical device, a moral fable about the dangers of pride and corruption. But in 1882, an American politician named Ignatius Donnelly changed everything. Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In it, he argued with enormous enthusiasm, if not always rigorous evidence, that Atlantis was real, that it had been located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that it was the common origin of all ancient civilizations. Egyptian pyramids and Mesoamerican temples, both inherited from Atlantis. The flood myths that appear in nearly every culture on Earth, all echoes of the same catastrophe. The alphabet, agriculture, metallurgy, all gifts of the Atlanteans. The book was a sensation. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies across dozens of editions. It was translated into multiple languages. Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, was reportedly so convinced by it that he attempted to persuade the British government to fund an expedition to find Atlantis on the ocean floor. The book launched a global obsession. Suddenly, everyone was looking for Atlantis. Expeditions were organized. Theories multiplied. The lost continent appeared in novels, in scientific journals, in newspaper headlines. Psychics claimed to have visited it in visions. Edgar Cayce, the famous American mystic, predicted in the 1930s that Atlantis would rise from the ocean floor near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas, and remarkably, in 1968, divers discovered a mysterious underwater stone formation near Bimini that looked, to some eyes, like a road or wall. Scientists examined it and concluded it was a natural formation. But believers were not convinced. And the debate continues to this day. Treasure hunters dragged equipment across the ocean floor. Submarines descended into the darkness. Sonar mapped the seabed in greater and greater detail. And yet, the island was never found. Because the problem with Atlantis is not the lack of theories. It is the excess of them. Atlantis has been located at various points in history in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in Bolivia, in Turkey, in Ireland, in Sweden, in the Sahara Desert, beneath the North Sea, and beneath the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. They cannot all be right. So where do we actually look? And more importantly, what are we actually looking for? Modern researchers who take Atlantis seriously, and there are credible ones, generally focus on a much smaller set of possibilities. And the most compelling of them is an island you may have already heard of. Santorini. In the Bronze Age, this island, then known as Thera, was home to a thriving Minoan settlement called Akrotiri. The Minoans were extraordinary. They were the first major civilization in Europe. They had running water, multi-story buildings with indoor plumbing, elaborate frescoes depicting dolphins and dancers and flowering meadows, and a trade network that stretched across the entire Mediterranean world, from Egypt to mainland Greece to the coast of modern Turkey. Their ships were the finest of the ancient world. Their cities were prosperous and densely populated. By any reasonable measure, they were the most advanced civilization in the Mediterranean at their time. Then, sometime around 1600 BC, disaster struck. The volcanic island of Thera erupted. Not gently, not with any warning that gave people time to escape. With a force that scientists estimate was 4 to 40 times more powerful than the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, one of the most violent volcanic events in recorded history. The eruption literally tore the center of the island apart, collapsing it into the sea and leaving the crescent-shaped caldera that visitors see today when they visit Santorini. The eruption did not just destroy the island. It triggered massive tsunamis, walls of water 60 feet high, that struck the coasts of Crete, Egypt, and the Levant without warning. It sent ash clouds across the region that turned the sky dark and may have disrupted agriculture for years. In Egypt, ancient texts describe years of darkness and failed harvests around this time, and it contributed, many historians now believe, to the collapse of the Minoan civilization itself, which disappeared from the historical record within a few generations of the eruption. The parallel to Plato's story is striking. A sophisticated island civilization, advanced beyond its contemporaries, wealthy, powerful, with a great navy. Sudden, catastrophic destruction from the earth itself, sinking beneath the waves. There are problems, of course. The timing is wrong by a significant margin. Plato says Atlantis fell 9,000 years before his time, but Thera erupted only around 3,600 years ago. And the location is wrong. Plato places Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond Gibraltar, not in the Mediterranean. But Plato was working from a story passed down through generations and translated across multiple languages. Numbers, locations, names. All of these could have been distorted across centuries of retelling. 900 years might have become 9,000. The Mediterranean might have been misremembered as the Atlantic. The Minoan hypothesis remains the most archaeologically credible explanation for the core of Plato's story, and it has been supported by serious scholars, including the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, who devoted much of his career to making the case. But it is not the only candidate worth considering. Some researchers refuse to abandon the idea that Atlantis was exactly where Plato said it was, in the Atlantic Ocean. And here, the geography becomes genuinely interesting. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean runs a massive underwater mountain range called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a chain of volcanic peaks stretching nearly 10,000 miles, from the Arctic all the way to the southern tip of South America. It is one of the longest mountain ranges on Earth. The islands of the Azores, rising from the surface of the North Atlantic, are simply the exposed peaks of this ridge. Could the Azores, or a now submerged section of the ridge, be the remnants of a larger landmass that once rose above the ocean? Geologically, the straightforward answer is no. The Atlantic Ocean is ancient, formed over hundreds of millions of years as the continents of Africa and the Americas slowly pulled apart. There is no geological mechanism that would cause a continent-sized landmass to sink into the ocean within the last 12,000 years. But there is something genuinely interesting beneath those waters that keeps the Atlantic theory alive. In 2013, researchers from the Geological Survey of Brazil announced they had discovered what they believed to be a large submerged granite plateau off the coast of Rio de Janeiro, at a depth of around 900 feet. Granite is a rock type associated with continents, not with the volcanic rock that forms ocean floors. Finding granite on the Atlantic seafloor was unexpected, and scientists are still debating what it means. Was this Atlantis? Almost certainly not. The plateau is far too deep and far too far south to match Plato's description. But it is a reminder that the Atlantic Ocean floor still holds genuine geological surprises, and that our understanding of it is less complete than we sometimes assume. There is also the question of sea level. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels worldwide were around 400 feet lower than they are today. Coastlines that are now underwater were dry land. Vast areas of the continental shelves, the shallow edges of continents, were exposed. Islands that are now submerged were above water. Could some of these now flooded coastal regions have been home to communities that preserved memories of the land they had lost? Memories that eventually, after thousands of years of retelling, became the story of Atlantis? It is not impossible. Oral traditions in indigenous cultures around the world preserve detailed memories of coastlines that were flooded at the end of the Ice Age. The human memory of rising seas is older and more persistent than most people realize. The underwater survey technology available today would have seemed like pure magic to previous generations of explorers. And every year, we map more of the ocean floor with greater precision than ever before. Whatever is down there, we will eventually find it. Now we have to ask the question that many Atlantis believers find deeply uncomfortable. What if Plato made it up? Not completely, not from nothing. But what if he took real elements, the Minoan collapse, Egyptian records of ancient floods, stories of sunken cities along Mediterranean coastlines, and wove them into a philosophical narrative designed to make a specific political point? Because that is exactly what Plato did in almost every other dialogue he wrote. Plato was not a historian. He was a philosopher, one of the greatest who ever lived, and his writings were tools for exploring ideas, not records of events. He used fictional characters, invented conversations, and constructed elaborate scenarios specifically to examine questions of justice, virtue, knowledge, and power. The Republic, one of the most influential texts in the entire history of human thought, describes an ideal city governed by philosopher kings. It is not a real place. No one has ever argued that we should be searching for the ruins of Plato's Republic. We understand it as a thought experiment. The symposium invents a dinner party where Socrates and his friends discuss the nature of love. It is not a transcript of a real conversation. Timaeus and Critias, the dialogues where Atlantis appears, are not primarily stories about Atlantis. They are discussions about the nature of the cosmos, the origins of the universe, and the ideal state. Atlantis is the villain of the story, not its hero. It is the counterexample that makes Athens look virtuous by comparison. In that context, Atlantis reads far less like a historical report and far more like a parable. The empire that overreaches. The civilization that mistakes power for wisdom. The kings who forget that they are servants of divine law and begin to believe they are above it. The pride, the hubris that inevitably brings the flood. Plato was writing in the shadow of two great catastrophes. He had watched Athens lose the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. He had watched his mentor Socrates executed by an Athenian democracy he believed had lost its way. He was deeply concerned with the question of what makes a civilization great and what causes it to fall. Atlantis was his answer, dressed in the robes of ancient history to give it weight and distance. If Plato invented Atlantis as a moral lesson, and the evidence for this is strong, he could not have known that his invention would grip the human imagination for 2,500 years, that people would spend fortunes searching for it, that entire scientific careers would be devoted to finding it, that it would become, perhaps, the most enduring mystery story the world has ever produced. And yet here we are, still looking, which raises a fascinating question. Why? The rational part of the brain knows or strongly suspects that Atlantis is a myth. And yet the story survives. It grows, transforms. Every generation finds new meaning in it, new reasons to believe, new theories to explore. Why? Because Atlantis is not really about an island at the bottom of the ocean. It never was. Atlantis is about what we fear most, that great civilizations can vanish, that everything we build is temporary, that the ocean of time will eventually swallow even the greatest empires, the most beautiful cities, the most sophisticated cultures, without leaving so much as a trace. We look at our own world, our cities, our technology, our interconnected networks of global trade and communication, and somewhere in the back of the mind, a quiet voice asks, could this happen to us? History says yes. The Maya built cities in the jungle that housed millions of people. They mapped the stars with extraordinary precision. They developed a writing system, a calendar, a philosophy. Then the rains stopped coming, the cities emptied, and the jungle reclaimed everything. The Romans built roads that still carry traffic 2,000 years later. They invented concrete, running water, central heating, and a legal system that forms the backbone of half the world's legal codes today. The empire is gone. The Minoans painted their walls with dolphins and flowers. They built palaces with indoor plumbing. They sailed to Egypt and the Levant and traded gold and saffron and fine pottery. The volcano came, and they vanished so completely that we did not even know their name until archaeologists gave it to them in the 20th century. And in every one of these cases, the Maya, the Romans, the Minoans, there were people living through the decline who could not imagine that it would end, who woke up every morning in their magnificent cities and assumed that what they had built would last forever. Plato understood something that modern archaeology has confirmed over and over again. Across every continent on Earth, civilizations collapse. Not slowly, not gracefully, not with dignity, but suddenly, completely, and often without any warning at all. Atlantis is the name we gave to that fear. The fear of the flood. The fear of the fire from the mountain. The fear that we are less permanent than we believe. And perhaps that is why the search will never truly end. Because as long as human beings are building civilizations, we will be haunted by the possibility of losing them. We search for Atlantis not only because we want to find a lost island. We search for it because we want to understand how great things end, and whether we can do anything to stop them. The ocean is deep. The past is deeper still. And somewhere, in the space between history and myth, between what Plato wrote and what the seafloor holds, Atlantis is still waiting. Waiting to be found. Or waiting to remind us of something we already know, but are afraid to say out loud. This has been Vanished Worlds. If this video made you think, if it left you with questions you want to explore, subscribe and come back. Because the ancient world is full of civilizations that vanished before we had the words to describe them. And we are only just beginning to find them.